As a nation, our greatest export has always been hope. Hope that through the rule of law, people can be free to pursue their dreams, that democracy can supplant suppression, and that justice, not power, will be the guiding force in society. Our moral authority in the world is derived from that hope anchored in the rule of law. With this blatant failure to respect the rule of law at the hands of the very agents of our government, we now face a great challenge in restoring America's moral authority in the world and demonstrating our commitment to bringing a better life to our global neighbors. During the presidency of Ronald Reagan, Secretary of Labor Ray Donovan was accused of corruption, but eventually, after a lot of publicity, the indictment was thrown out by the judge. Donovan asked the question, where do I go to get my reputation back? President Bush has now placed the United States of America in that same situation. Where do we go to get our good name back? The answer is, we go where we always go when a dramatic change is needed. We go to the ballot box, and we make it clear to the rest of the world that what has been happening in America for the past 3.5 years and what America has been doing in Iraq for the last 2 years really is not who we are. We as a people, at least the overwhelming majority of us, do not endorse the decision to dishonor the Geneva Conventions and the Bill of Rights in our Constitution. Make no mistake, though, the damage done at Abu Ghraib is not only to America's reputation and America's strategic interests, but also to America's spirit. It is crucial for our nation to recognize, and recognize quickly, that the damage done is far more serious than President Bush's belated and tepid response would lead people to believe. Remember how shocked each of us individually was when we first saw those hideous images. The natural tendency was to at first recoil from the images and then to assume that they represented a strange and rare aberration that came about because of a few twisted minds, or as the Pentagon said, a few bad apples. But as today's shocking news reaffirms yet again, this was not rare, and it was not an aberration. Today's New York Times reports that an Army survey of prisoner deaths and mistreatment in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I quote, show a widespread pattern of abuse involving more military units than previously known. Nor did these abuses spring from a few twisted minds at the lowest ranks of our military enlisted personnel. No, it came from twisted values and atrocious policies at the highest level of our government. This was done by our leaders in our name. These horrors were the predictable consequence of policy choices that flowed directly from this administration's contempt for the rule of law. And the dominance they have been seeking is truly not just unworthy of America, it also is an illusory goal in its own right. Our world is unconquerable because the human spirit is unconquerable. And any national strategy based on pursuing the goal of domination is doomed to fail because it generates its own opposition and in the process creates enemies for the would-be dominator. Specifically, in this case, a policy based on domination of the rest of the world not only creates enemies for the United States and creates recruits for Al-Qaeda, it also undermines the international cooperation that is essential to defeating the efforts of those terrorists who wish to harm and intimidate Americans. Unilateralism, as we have painfully seen in Iraq, is its own reward. Going it alone may satisfy a political instinct, but it is dangerous to our military. even without their commander-in-chief taunting terrorists to bring it on. Our troops are stretched thin and exhausted, not only because Secretary Rumsfeld contemptuously dismissed the advice of military leaders on the size of the needed force, but also because President Bush's contempt for traditional allies and international opinion left us without a real coalition to share the military and financial burden of the war and the occupation. And actually, our future is dependent upon increasing cooperation and interdependence in a world tied ever more closely together by technologies of communication and travel. Make no mistake, it is precisely our moral authority that is our greatest source of strength, and it is precisely our moral authority that has been recklessly put at risk by the cheap calculations and mean compromises of conscience wagered with history by this willful president. Listen to the way Israel's highest court dealt with a question similar to the one we now face, back when in 1999 it was asked to balance the rights of individual prisoners against dire threats to the security of its people. Here is what they said, quote, "This is the destiny of democracy, as not all means are acceptable to it and not all practices employed by its enemies are open before it. Although a democracy must often fight with one hand tied behind its back, it nonetheless has the upper hand. Preserving the rule of law and the recognition of individual liberty constitutes an important component in its understanding of security. At the end of the day, these add to its strength." The last and best description of America's meaning in the world, relevant to our trial today, is still the definitive formulation of Lincoln's message to Congress in December of 1862. He said, "The held high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new,